So I'm excited to share some of my work with you this morning on narrative mediation. I have quite a lot of slides, and I'm wishing I could have the multiple languages you speak up there. I'm thinking I'm not going to get through all of the material that are on the slides. I don't want to get caught up in feeling like I have to go through everything, but rather the main job I think this morning is to give an introduction and foundation to some of the ideas, some of the theoretical philosophical framework, and then if we have time, touch on some of the techniques arising from the practice. And go down that track. And if any of you have a burning question or a comment as we go, we will pause and take the time. In general, you're probably mostly hearing from me through the morning. So many of you received last night an email with all of the slides. So if you check your computer or your phone, you might be able to have those. And Pascal said, those of you that did not get the slides, she's very happy if you communicate with her to send the slides to you, so that everyone can have a copy. This quote, I think, is a good place to start. We are very much held in the world by the story. We all come from many different places, but we all share in common the centrality of the story. The stories, the multiple stories that hold our lives together. So when you go home, you're sharing things at the conference, you will be telling a story and linking certain events together into a narrative to make meaning of your experience and to help the people you're talking to make meaning of your experience. So the metaphor of the story carries through in a universal context. So we live our lives through stories. Stories shape and guide who we are. Now, I come from a psychology background. Some of the older psychological traditions are very focused on the self and focused on things that are coming up from the inside, the intrapsychic process. Narrative mediation is interested in the opposite direction. We're interested in what is going on in the macro, in the outside world, and how does the macro processes impact one's own sense of self, sense of movement, progression. And thus, we're focused on the broader cultural stories and cultural landscape in shaping our actions, rather than the internal process of drives. Not to deny the internal process, not denying that, but our focus is on the macro, outside-in process. And we are always in construction. And of course, the past holds enormous power in our narratives. And in the conflict resolution area, we all know that when we sit with people in conflict, the historical narratives drive the conflict. And in narrative mediation, our focus is on paying strong attention to these historical problem-saturated stories, these problem narratives, and recognizing their power. If we do not pay attention, those stories insist on being told. We cannot stop the past. We say, I don't want to hear about your problems, let's look to the future, let's talk about that. When human beings have stories to tell, they can't progress to the future or even be in the present oftentimes until some of these narratives get to be spoken. So the narratives are so much constructed from our past, and in narrative mediation, our job is to both hear the stories in particular ways and help make the parties in conflict transition to possibilities of creating alternative narratives, of other accounts, narratives that are about building understanding, building respect, and appreciation for the other. And that's the mission of the work, but getting there takes a good amount of time to address the problem stories of the past. And not that they disappear either, but we wanted to create context for the new. So these stories impact every aspect of our lives. The stories shape our lives. When you're growing up, your family had stories they developed about you, who you are, who you were as a person, growing up as a small child. The narratives describe who you are and who you become. My father used to say to me, "Big ears, you're interrupting a conversation between mother and me, and you always interrupting and talking and wanting to know things." And he says, "You're big ears," meaning I'm always listening and wanting to know and be curious. And so he told the story about me as big ears. And so I feel I've been inhabiting the story of big ears for my whole life. So these stories have real effects on our lives. Think about in school, the stories that are created about children in school. Children who had the experience that I'm stupid, I don't know anything. And how the stories of not having a sense of knowing has so much power in being able to learn something new if you are captured by the story of, I'm not smart. Alternatively, I have a story about myself as being smart and I can take new information on, then that story carries a lot of weight in people's lives. And maybe some of you, when you think about your own careers, how did you get to be the career you're in? And if you start to trace the history of your careers, it all really makes sense in terms of the narrative construction of who you have become. So I wanted to talk to you about curling. So curling, I looked this up yesterday on Google, the Bible, the modern day Bible. And in 1807, there was the first curling club in Montreal. And this sport, I discovered, has been in this particular part of the world for the first club was formed 210 years ago. And I'm using the metaphor of the curling game, and probably most of you at least probably know this game. Those of you that come from other places and are less familiar, you have a large stone, and you work in a small team, and the stone is cast off down the ice, and the job of the team, the curling team, is to maneuver it with brooms and sweepers to arrive at the bullseye. You want the stone to land right on the bullseye. the game of curling captures so much of what narrative mediation does. It's such a strong team process that everyone has a role, everyone has a significant part to play in being able to work together. And the focus is on reducing the restraint of the stone to move across the ice. So it's about moving obstacles away for the stone to travel. And so in narrative mediation, we're looking at how do we diminish the obstacles away, and through team effort between the mediator and the parties to work together to move our purpose, our vision, our hopes forward with the back and forth required of a curling team. So it requires very excellent communication, a good relationship, and narrative spends much of the time building the relational space before we work on the problem space. Many of you are familiar with the problem-solving model, where you identify what the problem is, you brainstorm solutions. Many are familiar with that model where let's come up with 10 different ideas about how to solve this problem, and then you work with the parties to select 3 or 4 where they overlap, and now we have agreement around these particular ideas, and let's put them together to make an agreement. My experience of that model is if there's not a good relational climate created, you can agree on a solution, but if you don't have the relationship to carry the solution out, the solution breaks down very quickly. So in narrative, we're very focused on the relationship building first, and then from building a relationship with the parties, we then move towards problem solving in that order. So from a narrative perspective, what is the cause of conflict, disagreement? And what we would propose is that conflict is created by a collision of expectation. When you're expecting one thing to happen and I'm expecting something different to happen, we are now on a pathway to disconnection. And if you think about when you get very upset and disturbed, you often find it is a contrast and conflict with what you're expecting should happen. It's not fitting your story of how things should be. And so we often, when we have different expectations, we look to the other as being the problem because they're not fitting the expectations that we are having about what should occur. And so understandings, meanings, and perceptions all are at play. And when they do not align, we have conflict. So I have a clip. I'm going to show a few small video clips. And I'm wanting to illustrate this point through using an advertisement for a chocolate bar. And what I want you to look for is the collision of expectation in the video. Collision of expectation. It says a lot in such a short clip. But it does capture this, and if I could leave you with anything about narrative work, is capturing the outside in, the meaning making that comes from the cultural frameworks that are at play, and how they get lived out in the moment, in this individual moment, in this particular set of events. Many of you are trained in interest-based mediation, and there are some connections between narrative and interest-based. What our emphasis is on is how are interests constructed in the first place. So when we're doing multicultural, multi-community, multi-ethnic conversation and discussion, interest by itself starts near the end. But what about all of the meaning making that is the producing of the interest? So that's why we are so interested in the cultural fabric and the cultural narratives. Little bit of context for narrative mediation. We began practicing this work in New Zealand in the family court mediation. We had couples divorcing in conflict about parenting plans, matrimonial property, child support, and the New Zealand government paid for 6 meetings with divorcing couples to help create a plan for post-divorce connection regarding the care of the children. So we started in a relational context, because if you can't help the couple start to talk together, the plans that are created are going to break down very quickly. So that was the beginning. We've done work in Cyprus, in the Green Zone, with Turk and Greek Cypriots. I've been doing work in Myanmar with the ethnic communities in Myanmar over the last decade, and teaming up with Eastern Mennonite University in Myanmar. So those are two areas of international context. Narrative practices are used in tenant-landlord, working with Indigenous issues in New Zealand, Australia, and South Africa. And we are now known in certain parts of the world where different models of mediation is taught, and I discovered that maybe one of you here has written a book, and you included a chapter on narrative mediation, which I was very happy to hear about. So these are some of the people that developed the work. Michael White and David Epstein. Michael White is who passed away 10 years ago now, is from Australia, who developed narrative therapy, which is such an important part of the development of narrative mediation. David Epstein is a Canadian from Toronto, who is a family therapist who lives in New Zealand. Sarah Cobb is an attorney at the University Mason University in the East Coast of the United States, who's written some great work, and I've got her references at the end of this presentation. And John Winslade and myself, I've worked with the other group to develop the work. So I've got an example to illustrate our how we so love to make meaning through the story. So I'm going to show you a series of events, and I want you to notice how you're responding as you look at the events. So we have Alex, who takes out the garbage, or in New Zealand, the rubbish, or the trash, takes it out into the driveway for collection. That's what he's doing. He is waiting for his mother to arrive any minute. He turns on the brightest porch lights, he lets the dog out, and then he comes to the living room window, waiting expectantly for her arrival. You can see the picture. He knew all these gestures would make her furious. When she was furious, she required that he eat in the bedroom. He could then avoid the angry conversations with his mother's new partner and just quietly listen to his favorite music. That's right. There was a disconnection with the narrative in many of your minds. Many of you, I think, were starting to form a very benign, warm, tender, connecting narrative based on how much information? Just, what, on 2 sentences? Yep. So based on such small amount of information, we are driven to make meaning and align things in a particular way as a narrative, as a story, as a sequence. And then when the sequence doesn't work, it creates surprise. But then we then work it back in, so we are now more comforted that we now have a story that all fits together and we can move on. So stories are made up. We're familiar with this. We have victims, heroes, villains, and rescuers. We are all very familiar with the story. We're also familiar with the story. It has a beginning. Often the story has a sudden turn, a bit like the scenario I just showed. Unanticipated things happen. Then there are climactic moments. And often we are seeking some kind of completion in our story. We like to have some kind of completion. In our work, though, there are themes in these narratives that we want to pay attention to. And some of you are very passionate about some of the themes. And in some of the stories that we have to deal with in the conflict zone are stories that have sexism, that are around power relations, power over, domination. We have stories of recognition and themes around betrayal and distrust. So embedded in the narratives are usually some of these elements that are very difficult to work with. Our stories take place in different locations, with different ethnicities, with different religious practices, different socioeconomic conditions. So all of these things are at play when we're thinking about conflict resolution. And if we're not paying attention to the macro level contextual elements, we're going to do people a disservice because of our more simplistic analysis of what's going on. Some of the key theoretical concepts of narrative mediation. I like to start by telling the story about 2 frogs. This is an old story. Many of you are familiar with it. It's a metaphor used by Gregory Bateson, who is a psychologist and ethnographer from the 60s, 50s and 60s, 1960s. And he spoke about the concept of news of difference in terms of making meaning. And news of difference is best shown by thinking about a frog in a pot of cold water. The frog is in the cold water. the pot of water is put on a flame, the water slowly heats, and the frog continues to be in the water, and then the water gets hotter and hotter and hotter, and then the frog, what happens? The frog dies. The frog passes over. So the second frog is in the same pot of cold water, and then taken out of that cold water and put in a pot of extremely hot water. What does the frog do? The frog tries to jump out or jumps out of the really hot, the same water that killed the first frog. How do we explain this? And as we know, the body temperature of the frog is adjusting to its environment. Imperceptibly, the water is heating. Imperceptibly, the body temperature of the frog adjusts, and catastrophe. But when we can create an environment that creates a news of difference, where we contrast what is happening in terms of the trend and make it more dramatic and more intense, people can recognize, oh my goodness, what is happening to us, to me, in the direction things are going. Because as human beings, we do the same thing as like the first frog. We adjust and adjust and adjust to sometimes harmful problem situations that end up being terrible. But we don't realize that we should have acted before because we didn't realize what is happening. And if you live in the United States right now, you can really get a feeling of what it's like to be the first frog. So the concept of news of difference is a really important element of creating contrast. The second is about the centrality of the story, and we've already started to talk about that. And Jerome Bruner, the famous cognitive psychologist who did a lot of excellent development of the narrative, the story, and psychology, has been a very central figure to this work. Edward Bruner, ethnographer from the United States, had some great writing on the power of the meaning making of the story and culture. The last picture is, many of you are very familiar with Michel Foucault's work, the famous French historian, philosopher, and many other names. It's hard to kind of pigeonhole him. Michel Foucault's work became very important in the development of narrative therapy and narrative mediation. And one of the ways of describing his work and the significance of his work in this model is the picture of the panopticon prison. Now, some of you are criminologists and have studied the metaphors used by Foucault. And the panopticon was designed in France as a prison that required very little payment to prison guards, because each cell had a small window where the guard could look through the window into the cell at any time, 24 hours a day. The prisoner never did know whether the guard was looking through the window or not. So the guards would circulate, but they didn't need many guards because the experience of the prisoner was that they were always under surveillance. So this metaphor, I think, captures very well this idea of how the cultural narratives, the cultural stories, the cultural practices in our communities are like the prison guard that surveil us, that we are under surveillance all of the time in the way we conduct our lives. We are always measuring ourselves against the cultural norms of our community. And when we get out of alignment with the cultural norms, we suffer. Often, we suffer. And if we don't, we are often having to be courageous. So with Michel Foucault's idea about the macro-level discursive context, how these practices are shaping of our lives and are shaping of conflict, and how conflict arises when we start not being in alignment with the cultural norms. And it's another illustration of the outside-in approach to mediation. So I have another clip. There's some English back and forth, but I think you'll get the general idea. And this clip that you're going to see is an illustration of the new cultural norms that are taking over the entire planet. You now can go nearly everywhere in the world, and you are seeing people walking around like this. This is what people do now. They are everywhere in the world. You go just right. A lot of you travel around the world, and this is what you see everywhere. And this is very powerful in terms of what it's doing to people's lives.
Right? Happy B-Day.
Okay, Ms. Brownstein, you are here to declare social bankruptcy. I want you to be clear on what this means. You will be absolved of all debt. All your Facebook friends will be gone. All your emails and voicemails will be deleted. All your Twitter followers will be gone. You'll be able to start with a clean slate. But this is kind of the nuclear option. Did I get that?
It's like it physically hurts when it goes off.
I just want you to know
Sorry,
what...
hold on.
If you need to, you know, like a couple friends' Instagrams or something.
I don't want to do any of that anymore.
We do offer counseling to help you sort of get out of debt.
I've tried that. I feel like my bandwidth is just full.
I have some template responses I use. Pet pictures. I'll just write cute, just like with a bunch of O's.
Cute is with a U.
No, CYOOOOT.
I appreciate that you've come up with a method for dealing with it. I don't want to live my life like that. Are you supposed to put that in there?
I'm so jacked up right now. You know, Pink retweeted me recently.
Yeah, that must feel fulfilling.
Huge. One of my biggest ones. Play on words. I said, abacus is a machine you can really count on.
I can't wait to miss out on jokes like that.
All right, Ms. Brownstein. You can sign right there.
I'll go to the library and find something in a book and...
What's a library? Is that like a big Kindle?
Oh my God, Fred, I just got back from Powell's. I got so many books. I got that one Lori Moore book that I have not read yet. I went to acupuncture, then I got a massage. I just have so much time. I feel like I'm just soaking it all in. I feel so alive.
I'm sorry, do I know you from someplace?
Seriously?
Yeah. You seem very cute, and I hope that we met somewhere great. Are you visiting Portland?
Fred, it's Carrie.
Carrie? Carrie what?
Brownstein, B-R-O-W-N-S-T-E-I-N. Listen.
Okay, are you on Facebook?
No, I'm not on Facebook anymore.
So you're not on there. Are we friends?
Yes, we're best friends.
We're best friends.
We're best friends.
Let me just Google you. Wow, I've never seen a blank Google page. It's almost like you don't exist. You're not on Google at all, Carrie Brownstein.
Steen.
I don't know anything about you if you're not on here or on Are you on Instagram?
No.
There's a little bit of subtlety to it, but any of you that spend time with young people, imagine the world that they are growing up in. They're in the world that we're in too, but at a level beyond anything I can imagine. In the United States, in the classroom, the electronic device is not very far away, and they're tracking how many likes they have from their friends and their community. And yesterday, you know, with the big stick with the camera, and everyone is kind of, you know, looking at themselves. I was at the beach a few weeks ago. I'm sitting, beautiful, beautiful ocean, and the water is so inviting. And I'm watching a group of young people, like 16, 18 years old. They're in bathing suits, all very nice, and they are running to the ocean. And I'm thinking, oh, I so remember being young and free and running and diving into the ocean. So I'm seeing them. They're running and running and running. And then they stop at the edge of the ocean. And then all of the selfie sticks come out, and the cameras, and the angles, like this, suits, everything. And then they walk back to sit down, because they can't live in the present moment and enjoy their lives, because they're crafting their identities in the social landscape and creating the narratives of who they are as human beings in cyberspace. And so the clip speaks to the power of identity, power of construction of the story of who we are. And if we dislodge ourselves from that, are we nothing? And for young people especially. So this speaks to the cultural fabric on which our communities are being built. Michel Foucault contributed so much to the notion of discourse, background cultural ideas at play. When I was doing a lot of mediation in the family court, I would discover that a lot of the background cultural ideas held by the parties in conflict was, many men said, the children should be in my custody because I am the head of the household and I am the breadwinner and I should have the decision making. It never came out like that, obvious, but when you got into the conflict, there was this idea. Many, many women said, the children, they are mine. They belong to me. They came from my body. I breastfed them. The children are my children. I am not going to have my ex-husband have a role and presence in taking them away from me. The idea of that women are very emotional and available, and men are very distant and not able to connect with the children. So when there's conflict, they're fighting over how many days they will be with the children or who has more money. What's going on is all of the background cultural assumptions and meaning making. And if we don't, from a narrative perspective, start to bring forward the background cultural meanings, we are limited in the extent to which we can resolve the specific issues that are in front of us. So I'm now reinforcing this idea about culture about how the stories are shaped by wider culture. And not every story is equal. We know that some narratives, some stories, carry much more weight in our communities than other stories. There's nothing equitable about stories in terms of their power to shape society. And we are in often a process of competing narratives. And it's often very best shown in the political landscape about the competing narratives of what is happening to our society. These narratives position us. They position us in particular ways. If these are narratives that we embrace, they give us power, they give us authority, they give us influence. If these are narratives that diminish us, that don't have us included. They don't allow us to have voice, or if we want a voice, it's very difficult to be heard and to break through. Stories also generate certain ideas about rights. I have these rights that are often unquestioned. It's just how it is. It's natural. It's obvious that I have these rights and you don't have these rights. So stories legitimate a sense of entitlement to particular aspects of the culture. We've talked about some of the themes of stories. Often these get played out in some way in every conflict that you are having to work with, right? The issues of respect are critical in every community. Issues around distrust. It's very hard to run a society if there's no trust. Very, very difficult to be in a community with no trust. We are very well trained in many, many communities to characterize individuals as the problem. We have betrayers. There's a little boy kissing a little girl, and clearly he is a betrayer, especially to the little girl on the right side. We have psychological descriptions for people. Those of you in the psychology area familiar with the borderline personality, we're very good at coming up with names to describe people and characterize them, completely separate from the social context that they inhabit, because we're so focused on the promise of individualism. And so individualism, and I know at the conference yesterday I heard discussions about neoliberalism and its embedded connections to capitalism and individualism. And so these characterizations of human beings are very much supported by these dominant discourses of neoliberalism. And enough said probably on that slide. So this set of symbols is representing events that we are living in the world. Right now, one of those objects is a symbol of us gathered here. Right now, you're sitting here, you're looking to me, I'm talking with you. That's a lived event. We have lived events happening at every moment of our lives. So I'm characterizing these as lived events. But we can't live our lives with a whole bunch of lived events, because we have to connect them, because we just have to make meaning and have to build a narrative around them. So in the conflict resolution area, we have, here's an example, because I work with families quite a lot. You have the courtship story where a couple have come together, they are fallen in love, and they give a story about their partner. This man, he is so warm and he's so gentle, he's so kind, and he's so thoughtful, and most importantly, he is so good at listening. He's there to listen and understand me, and I feel so cared for by this man. Courtship story. Some events happen, some years go by, now they're in the family court in New Zealand, where I did a lot of this. This man, he is ignorant. He does not listen. He needs training in communication. He has no heart. He's cold. And the story, the courtship story, has now got a very different dimension. So what happens is we link events together, and the red objects are the negative things, the negative lived events. And we put everything together in a particular way. And yet, that's not everything that's happened. That's not the lived life. It's a series of things that got lived together in a narrative and become the problem-saturated story. So in narrative mediation, we're paying attention to this power of the story as it all gets linked together, but also recognizing it's not everything. It's not the whole reality. There's way more than is getting demonstrated. So I got another clip. I'm wanting you to do a little experiment with me. I know a lot of you have probably seen this clip before, but I always find that sometimes there's some folks who haven't seen it. And it's going to illustrate the points that I'm making, I hope, in ways that drive the point home. You're going to see two basketball teams. One team has got white shirts, and the other team has got black shirts. And in the experiment, your task is to count the number of passes, basketball passes, between the team with the white shirts. So I'm going to click it, and it's going to start very quick, and your job is to see how many passes can be made. Okay, how many passes? 15, 16? I think it's maybe 17, if you're counting the ones that bounce on the ground. Now, some of you have seen this video and know exactly where I'm going with this. So just bear with me. I know I'm going to give up this video one day because everyone has seen it and it doesn't work anymore. So forgive me. But maybe there's one or two who haven't seen it. Those that have only seen this for the first time, how many? Show of hands, you've seen it? This is the first time you've seen it. Oh, very good. Okay, that's quite a lot of you. How many of you who saw this for the first time saw the gorilla? Yes. Not as many hands went up that time. Not as many hands. You're looking astonished. You're looking astonished. Yes, you did. You saw it. You saw it. You saw it. Yep. Okay, good. But a few of you did not see it. How could you possibly not see the gorilla on the video? It is so obvious. It's so obvious. Now you're starting to feel really bad, those of you that missed it. Let me show you again. This time, look for the gorilla. Look for the gorilla. The gorilla. It's the same experiment. Keep looking. Your question is, was it there the first time? And I am going to laugh with you because I could not see the gorilla the first time. I could not see it. But it was there all of the time. It was walking across the stage like this, and it beat it like this. How could you possibly miss that? Because you were looking for the white passes. You saw all the time. Because you know there's always more there. You saw it the first time. And some of you have this ability to look at multiple things happening at the same time. I'm somewhat handicapped because when I'm looking at one thing, I'm often missing out on other things that are happening at the same time. And I think this experiment shows very well our ability to perceive only some things that are happening around us, and there are other things going on too that are really significant. And so I'll explain in a minute why that video is helpful in terms of making a point. So I think your point is, if you're seeing a lot of other things, maybe you're not looking so closely at the task at hand. The point here is, in narrative practice, when we're hearing the problem-saturated story, we know that there are other events outside of the story that deserve being paid attention to. And this is a critical piece of the work. So when we're hearing the problem-saturated story, we are not holding it as the only reality. It is a story. It is a narrative. And so the narrative mediator is always listening for any part of the account that hints at another reality that is in the background, that's not getting expressed. And that's where a lot of the techniques of narrative mediation come in, of developing practices that track the blue objects and the work to create an alternative, preferred narrative based on understanding, on mutuality and respect. Not that the problem-saturated story is going to disappear. It doesn't. That's a Pollyanna-ish notion about life. The old narratives hang around, and they are ready to come rushing back. But we can create other co-constructed narratives that can build understanding and respect. So when we hear the problem-saturated story, we're listening to the story not as the problem person, because the story is always going to be told with problem people. They're going to be characterized as problem people. Anyone that sits down with you with a conflict, who are they focused on when they start telling the story? They're focused on the other. They're focused on the blame of the other. That's where they are located in there. So they're focused on the person is the problem. In narrative mediation, the mantra to the mediator is the problem is the problem. The person is not the problem. So when you think about, you're going to hear lots of conversation about the abuser. From a narrative mediation lens, we're hearing it as abuse and harm, and the effects of abuse and harm. So we're moving away from abuser to abuse. So we're not moving away from abuse, but we're putting abuse in the middle and then looking at the effects of the problem on the parties and on the conflict. Someone who is a betrayer. He is a betrayer. He betrayed me. We are focused on not the betrayer, but the betrayal. What has the betrayal done? How has the betrayal affected you? Both the person doing the betraying and the person being betrayed, how is the behavior affecting the parties in their abilities to understand, to know, to progress? So the problem is the problem, the person is not the problem. And that is a mantra, a central idea. And when you think about the work, it is contextualized as the wider cultural frameworks and how they have affected the individual. So the problems are created in the discursive space, in the cultural landscape. That's where the problems are created, and they're played out in the individual process. We have time for an activity before we break. So it's good to get you engaging and talking with one another. So the activity I have in mind is, it's a little risky. It's a bit of a risky activity. It's asking you to tell a small story about a small conflict. Not a big conflict. And it's a story where, you know, it was not a traumatizing story. I don't want you to be spending time talking about a traumatizing story. That's not where we're going. But maybe a small conflict like one I had when I was moving house, and I was moving my household goods from one house to the other, and I'm renting a truck, a U-Haul truck, particular kind of truck, and we are moving our goods, and the truck breaks down, and I am in a conflict with the moving company who do not send out another truck, and they want to charge me more money for the truck that broke down. And so I'm very upset at the company because they betrayed me from the contract of a good truck and it breaking down. That's an example of the level of the story. So I'm wanting you to introduce yourself, if you don't know already, the person sitting next to you or behind you or in front of you. Introduce yourself, and then each of you take a turn at telling a small conflict story where you're in the conflict, okay? And then we're going to come back and we're going to analyze the conflict, and then you're going to talk again to your to the person and bring in some other things into the story. Is it clear what I'm asking? Okay. So let's take about 10 minutes, 5 minutes each to share the story. Thank you. It's going to be very difficult to cut across you and disrupt your story. But I want to move on. I'm going to ask you to pause, just have a pause, and then we're going to let you keep talking. So I promise, I'm going to let you finish. So we get very energized when we start to talk about a conflict. Yes, we do. We get so excited and so passionate. And we are so in touch with our mistreatment and how our expectations were so disappointed. We were so misunderstood. But when we tell the story, we have a particular story that we tell about the conflict. My story about the moving company. I am a victim of their bad policy. But I didn't tell you the whole story. Because I wasn't following all of their protocols. in contacting the right people to repair the truck. It was all in the contract. I went and did some other things that weren't the right approach to dealing with the problem. And it was all clearly written down in the contract. So if you talk to the moving company, who has been violated? The company has not been respected. So for your story then, when you're telling the story, imagine it was the people you were in conflict with and they were telling the story. What would they say? What would their story be about what happened? What did you miss out? Because maybe it was a bit embarrassing to say in the story. Some things got missed out in the telling. Think about if you were telling the story to your lover or a best friend, or how would the story change? So I want you to go back and think, what would the story have sounded like if the other was telling? What would they be saying? And how did I alter the story a little bit in telling you from if there was someone else I was telling? I know that is a big thing to ask you. So go back and maybe just for a couple more minutes, let's hear the other aspects that maybe did not get spoken. Wait, go ahead. Talk to the partner. Thank you for your involvement. I've presented quite a few concepts and ideas. You've just had an exercise. So I'd like to take a moment for discussion. Maybe some of you have some ideas you would like to share with us, and, or some questions. And, you know, we have all of these microphones and all of these chairs, so you're welcome to come and sit up here and share some thoughts or ask some questions to us. And we also have a microphone at the back. He's ready to go with his microphone. So let's take a little bit of time to discuss. Anyone like to start sharing their reflections about what we've covered so far? Yes, ready to go.
Quand j'ai raconté l'histoire du point de vue de l'autre personne, j'ai pensé à d'autres aspects que je n'avais pas reliés ensemble auparavant. Alors, quand j'avais raconté l'histoire à ma façon, si je peux dire, c'était un événement banal que je trouvais que l'autre exagérait. Mais quand je l'ai raconté de son point de vue, j'ai relié d'autres événements qui s'étaient passés la journée d'avant, le matin même, l'après-midi ensuite, et donc l'événement qui est survenu ce soir-là, qui semblait banal, pour elle était le résultat d'une accumulation que je n'avais pas vue quand je regardais ça de mon point de vue.
Great, thank you. Great example of what can happen. Excellent. Other reflections, both on the exercise or also just generally on some of the concepts and ideas so far?
My comment has to do with one of the earlier concepts, not the exercise. I was struck by the sentence when you said something like, it is not possible to, quote, get beyond the past in order to look forward, which is a temptation that some mediators have and that some parties in mediation have. You know, there's often a a disconnect between the expectations of the parties, where one wants to look forward and the other one wants to be heard about the past. And I was struck by that because it reminded me of some teachings that I came across in my practice of Buddhism, where it is said that the present is made up of the past.
Yes.
They're not actually three separate times, because the future will be made of the present. We
Yes,
are both in the
exactly.
present moment, the result of our past actions and deeds and the
Yes.
actions and deeds of the culture, and in the present we are creating the
Yes.
future.
Yes.
And even though it is also commonly said, well, you know, you can't change the past is what it is, that's not actually true, because in the present we can take care of the past. And that's a large part of what we do in mediation. Conflict is dealt with in
Yes.
the present,
Yes.
but we are addressing the past and taking care of the past. We can't change what happened, but we can change the effect of what happened on the parties now and going forward.
That's right. Beautiful. Beautiful. I absolutely agree. And the Buddhist ideas and work behind that making meaning is eloquently described. In narrative mediation, we want to meet with the parties in conflict separately first. When we first presented our work in North America in the late 90s, we got a lot of criticism and pushback from the community of mediators that said you should never meet with people separately before you sit down to a mediation, because what is going to happen to your neutrality and your impartiality? Because now you are meeting and forming these relationships with these people, and you're having all these conversations, and I am coming back to your point, and where is the open, impartial process?
You will be polluted.
Yes, you will be polluted. And so, one, we said, well, actually, we don't want to claim impartiality and neutrality, because the mediator is as affected by the cultural stories and the cultural context that they inhabit, and they influence everything that they do and the way that they think, and that the first step for the mediator is to do a lot of work in understanding their context. But that what we are striving for is to be able to present ourselves at the end of the process as being even-handed and experienced by the parties as being heard, and having, instead of a impartial notion, we have what Mélan Jacot talked about, which is multi-partiality, so that we are with the multiple meanings. Now, I am going to come back to your point. So we want to spend time with the parties, hearing and understanding their story, and that construction of the past is filtered in a particular way. The story tends to be very rigid, and the conflict, the hotter the conflict, the more rigid and tight the boundaries are. Inflexibility, non-negotiable. Don't you mess with my problem-saturated story. It is not to be re-storied or reinterpreted. It is what it is. And if you try and change it. But the idea is that by working separately with the parties, we are wanting to co-create a telling of the story that loosens the grip of it, that starts to loosen up the boundaries of the rigidity and the inflexibility and the non-negotiableness of the story. And so our effort is in alignment with what you've described about our capacity as human beings to reconstruct the past in the present and reconstruct the future in the present, and that we want to see human beings as having that capacity to do that and want to invite them gently into that territory. But we only go gently because of the holding on. And that's why I want to talk about some of the techniques a little bit later in the morning about externalizing. The problem is the problem, the person is not the problem. So when we're hearing the problem-saturated story, we're wanting to start reflecting it back as an external description and its effects on the person. Because as we were saying before, when you're in a conflict, the party is not, they're not looking at themselves. They are focused on the other. And so in the separate sessions, we want to turn the focus on what is the problem-saturated story doing to you? How is it being affected? And so by identifying the problem themes of betrayal, distrust, disrespect, dishonor, humiliation, we are capturing the themes of the problem-saturated story and reflecting them back to the parties and saying to them, what is this distrust? What has it done to you? What has the disrespect done to you? How is it affecting your life? How is it affecting your hopes and your dreams? And so by externalizing the problem, we are starting to disrupt the grip of the problem-saturated story. So that's part of the kind of technique of wanting to in a way, construct the past with a lightening of the problem-saturated story. So I think we have a couple more clips. I'm wanting to use a particular example of the dominant narratives that I experienced in Myanmar back in the around the 2006, 2007 period. Aung San Suu Kyi, who you'll all recognize up in the top left-hand corner, Nobel Peace Prize winner. You know of her work in working for peace in Burma, Myanmar. And we've got one of the generals, and I forget his name, but we know about the terrible harm that has occurred over decades by the military junta in Myanmar. And so coming into the country from the outside, it's quite easy to go, the person on the left is the Nobel Peace Prize laureate. They are the good person. And the person on the right is the general. Well, he's the bad person. And so we are so always captured by our wanting to quickly story who is the goodie, who is the baddie. And of course, many of us influenced by Hollywood and the movies. I grew up on cowboys and Indians and the Wild West, and the symbol there of who is the goodie and who is the baddie. And when we get captured by one-dimensional notions of reality, one-dimensional notions of truth, one-dimensional notions of good and evil, and people's parts to play, we can limit the way we can move in conflict resolution work. And there is some great examples in Myanmar of some of the generals working very, very hard for peace and finding and taking legitimate steps towards a peace process and a recognition of their efforts in some places to make movement in that way. And Aung San Suu Kyi, despite her extraordinary capacity and love and generosity, is not a saint. And if you think about what's going on right now in that country and the Muslim population who are being, the atrocities happening there, the reality is that there's much more complexity. There's always more complexity. And so from a narrative lens, we don't want to enter the space and be quickly captured by the unidimensional notions of life as good, as bad, and so it constrains our capacity as a conflict resolver to look for what is happening that's preferable, where people have done bad things, and being able to kind of acknowledge effort and not put parties on a pedestal as though there is nothing that there's to be made accountable or that there needs to be some new action on the other part. And so life is always more complex, and I come back to the idea of the blues and the reds. There are a multiplicity of things happening at the same time. So we're going for more complexity. Just the last explanation, just it's kind of interesting. A lot of you know the biblical story of David and Goliath. David being the benign, innocent defender of truth and protection, and Goliath representing all elements of abuse and violation. Some of you know the story with lots of depth. And in Myanmar, there are many men named David in the country. And the positioning of these cultural stories as this person who is representing virtue and is up against the impossible, i.e. the generals, and both how great it is to embrace the David in the virtuous aspects of strength and courage and determination, but also recognizing the naming also positions people in particular ways in terms of how they're showing up in relation to the challenge, the forces that they're against, and getting captured by unidimensional notions of truth and righteousness. And so I'm just struck by sometimes how that can play out. So we come for a break time. So we'll have a 15-minute break. After the break, we'll come back and do a little bit more theory, but then come back to some of the practices and techniques that narrative mediation uses for conflict. In the room where it's right in front of you. How could that be? It is shocking. How is this presentation working for you? Is it coming across clearly, the ideas? Are there some things that are confusing? Are there things that you're finding you're reacting to, going, oh, this is hard to listen to because my experience is so different to that? So I just want to check in a little with you about where you're coming from. And we do need a microphone, which is coming your way. And I need a headpiece as well. Uh-oh. This gentleman here? Gentleman here? Did you want to speak? Yes.
I don't need Mike.
But for the others, yes, they do.
Answering your question, you make sense.
Good. Oh, that's very easy. Any other comments reflections about the material so far?
C'est ma première approche. C'est la première fois que j'aborde la question, le sujet de la médiation narrative. Donc c'est juste, et donc c'est très, voilà, très toute première impression. Mais je voudrais être sûre, avant de continuer, d'avoir bien compris. Donc est-ce que ce que je comprends, et n'hésitez pas, bien sûr, si je n'ai pas compris, à corriger. Est-ce que l'un des objectifs de la médiation narrative, en quelque sorte, est d'objectiver le conflit, c'est de focuser davantage sur le problème et de le détacher de la personne? Et est-ce que ça revient en quelque sorte à objectiver le conflit? Je le formule, mais je ne suis pas sûre que ce soit tout à fait ça. Est-ce que vous pourriez m'aider à mieux le synthétiser?
So, yes, exactly. We want to create some distance from the problem, almost like to stand, maybe to put the problem on a screen, and we are looking at the problem, and we are a spectator to our own problem, and looking at it, and the mediator is sitting beside the party, looking at the problem, and how is the problem affecting the spectator. So we're trying to reposition the person from victimhood, from the status of the weight, to let's look at the story. And if we can work with both parties, multi-parties, looking with them independently, separately, not at the same time, looking independently at their problem-saturated narratives, and we start to identify the themes of mistrust, disrespect, themes that are about fragmentation and separation, we then can bring one of the parties on this side, the other party on this side, and collectively we are looking at a more complex picture, being united around shared experiences of mistrust, shared experiences of misunderstanding, shared experiences of disrespect, and that the problem is affecting us all in different ways, but we come together around the themes of separation. So I'm going to talk in a little bit about then what do we do after that? Like, what's the next step? So that's the first step. And the other job that I do is I'm the director of a program in marriage and family therapy, psychotherapist in San Diego. And so I work with a lot of families. And so you have a mother and father with a 14-year-old child, and the mother and the father bring the child to the therapist, and who is the problem? Problem is, my 14-year-old son, please fix my son, right? This is a classic, yeah. So the practitioner has choices. They focus on, I'm going to fix the son. But we know that there's a whole lot of complex issues going on with the mother, with the father, the mother and the father together, and the young person and their issues and their view of the mother and the father. So there are multiple things happening at the same time, but the family starts with who is the problem, who is the fault. The son is the fault. So a lot of these ideas of narrative mediation came from family dynamics and looking at the problem is the problem. So the young person is affected by disrespect by the parents towards the child. the parents experiencing disrespect by the child towards them, and it creates a problem dynamic of those themes, misunderstandings. So now we are sitting the family together going, the problem is communication, respectful communication, and now we are all gathered together, sitting together to address the problem situation and how it's affecting the son, how it's affecting the mother, how it's affecting the father, how it's affecting the mother and father. And we now are able to get into disidentifying the one scapegoat person. So that's kind of where the ideas come from in the emphasis on externalizing. So let's come back to Burma. Myanmar, a country of so much suffering, and so much suffering today, right now, what's going on in parts of the country there's some terrible fighting going on, despite all of the best efforts that are being made. We don't see a lot of what is going on there right now. Like so many other countries, there are many, many different tribal communities, very different ethnic communities, communities with different languages that are spoken, different traditions, and of course, Burma was created as part of a colonial picture, and now all of these different groups are vying with one another to have their voices heard, to be part of a democracy. And there have been some very significant breakthroughs. Any of you have been following the political landscape there. There have been some major strides forward in building connections between some of the groups. But it's very fragile. And like so many communities, there are stories that are told about the other. The stories told about who we are, and the stories told about who the other are. So this is just an illustration of some of the stories. So the Kachin people in the north of Myanmar, right on the border between China and Myanmar, the Kachin are storied in the country by many as the isolated group who are suspicious of everybody else, and that they see themselves as more status, and that they are fierce warriors. And so there's both an identity and a pride among the Kachin about who they are right up in the north, but also they have suffered so greatly from, and are suffering right now. It's one of the most dangerous parts of Myanmar, going up into the northern territory on the borders. There's still attacks being made by the Myanmar military with the Kachin people. And it's kind of bizarre because Myanmar is marketed as this great tourist destination, you know, the beautiful Buddhist temples, but the country is divided in areas where tourists are allowed to go to show this beautiful, peaceful, wonderful country, and all of these other areas where tourists are not permitted to go, including right up among the Kachin people. And then you've got the Korean and the perception of them being adept at moving around and being able to connect with other cultural communities. And a lot of the Korean people are in rural Myanmar. Another group which is less familiar to me are perceived as drug lords, drug carriers, smuggling, and so on. And so you get an identity of the WA group. Sorry, put the wrong button. The Shan come from ancient times, that there's a certain status that's held pre-British colonial powers coming in, and certain prides about how life should be lived. The Chen and the largest ethnic group in Myanmar, the Mon, who were very much part of the British Empire and surviving and negotiating that last colonizing effort of the country. And so you've got, like in many places, these identities that are formed, these tribal identities, these linguistic identities, and they're all bundled together in one country that borders were drawn at a particular stage in part of Southeast Asia, and all trying to negotiate how to live peacefully together in a democracy, which is a model of political organization that has in many ways foreign to many of the groups. So it's such a complex process, and it's symptomatic of so many other places on the planet, of trying to negotiate. And all of the different multiple stories that each ethnic community has to tell. So I have another one as well from my country. The Maori, Polynesian, who came to these two islands in the Pacific, right at the bottom of the world, around between 800 and 1200 AD. Traveled across the Pacific, as far as we know, from eastern Polynesia was the migration to this land called Aotearoa, the land of the long white cloud, otherwise known as New Zealand, named by the first Dutch explorer, Abel Tasman, who sighted land and began to map the country. So the indigenous people of the Maori, proud, fierce warrior group, again made up of multiple different tribes, so similar in the landscape as in Myanmar. We have multiple tribes spread across the country. Tangata whenua is Maori for the people of the land. So when Maori introduce themselves, they begin the introduction by saying, "This is my mountain, this is my river, this is my forest," and it's always located in a geographical context based on the land, the people of the land. What happened? The Pākehā, my ethnic identity is Pākehā. I hold that name with pride. It's a Maori depiction of the settlers that came from the outside, and the Pākehā, embracing that term, juxtaposes whites in relationship to the Polynesian people. 1769, Captain James Cook coming, and then the British began to assert influence, like, again, so many parts of the world, being stealers and betrayers of the land from Maori. It's the classic story of land wars, of famine, of European disease, the whole reenactment of colonization on another scale. Pākehā as the colonizers, Maori, as in so many places, as in Canada, it's the same story with First Nation people. This is a very familiar story. Here you've got a figure painted in the 19th century with the tattoos, describing and depicting the indigenous heritage, and then taking on the dress of the colonials. I picked this picture to depict, do you know the character on the right-hand side? Prince Charles. Prince Charles, British monarchy, who made a deal with the Maori in 1840 to have a treaty that they would share the land and that they would give Maori sovereignty to the ocean and the land, but that they would have the British Crown protect the land on behalf of Maori. And guess what happened to the treaty? Like all the treaties that had happened before, of course they were violated. But it's an interesting emergence in New Zealand of the Maori entering a process of decolonization. And now these political figures, the artists, and the new generation of Maori of decolonizing their history, a reclaiming of the language, a reclaiming of the traditions, a reclaiming of the history. And now in New Zealand, we, like in Canada, there are 2 official languages in New Zealand, Māori and English. So all government documents in New Zealand must be in both languages. So we are excited that we have a slightly different story of the subjected, the colonized, and the colonizing, and to have this emerging reclamation. And the dominant cultural stories of Maori are re-emerging. Any of you that follow sport and know the game of rugby, it's an example of a place of a gathering of Māori Pākehā around a national sport. And it begins with the haka, which some of you, if you look on YouTube and look at how they begin a game of rugby in New Zealand, you watch the haka. And it's kind of emblematic of a people of both white Pākehā and Māori Polynesia finding ways of connecting, but connecting in a way that is honoring of the traditions of both, honoring of the languages. And we are very proud of being able to have a movement towards a decolonizing experience. It's just very unusual. And then there's something that is incredibly dominating right now that's happening. It's impacting the whole world. And it is the tribal narratives that are going on in the country south of the border. It's the Republican and the Democrat. It's these 2 dominant cultural stories that have enormous influence on shaping the political landscape. And I have placed quite deliberately a picture of these tribal conflicts. And I thought I'd just add the last slide in the middle of President Trudeau sitting with our president. And what I was trying to do was just show some emblems of the dominant cultural narratives that have developed in very rigid, narrow ways about the other. And I realized how I put it together speaks so much of my own context and what I am privileging in the telling of the story of the cultural narratives. And but I just couldn't help thinking that what's going on in the United States right now with my own extended family, where I have American family, I have American wife, and when the extended families come together, we enter into this tribal territory, and it's quite dangerous. When my extended relatives come and stay in my home, of what is shown on the television set, what stories are told, what news stories are told about reality, about what's going on, and it you know, when we talk about tribal, we think old indigenous with certain ideas about the tribe, and yet the cultural stories that are playing out now, and our president Trump has said to his tribe, I can go out on the street and I can shoot someone and no one will care. I've heard him say this a few times. And what I think emblematically that speaks to is how tribal a community can gather around certain stories and certain political ideas, and yet it doesn't matter what your leader does, but that you are part of that cultural story and part of that identity. And terrible things can happen, but it would not loosen the grip of the narrative and the meaning making about what is going on in that community. And it is quite terrifying to see the power of the story and what it can do and how we have to monitor our lives as a result. So I'm getting to now talk about techniques. Oh, go ahead. Let's have some comment. The microphone, please. And also, you can come and sit up here too. It'd be nice to have some company. Yes, I can absolutely go back to that.
I just find it interesting how much in your contemporary tribal narratives of the United States, the absence of First Nations is striking.
Yes.
It's that particular, you know, who were there before everybody else, is not there is unbelievable, and it tells about how stories include and exclude First Nations. They're not there in the United States.
The First Nation has only got represented in these cultural stories through the Keystone Pipeline. That in the dominant media systems right now, and so the Republican tribe, as represented, speaks about opening the Keystone Pipeline, embracing the success of the entrepreneurial capitalist story of getting the oil flowing, and the pride in the invigoration of the Keystone Pipeline as it traverses and cuts through the native people's area, and also going under the river, and the risk to that community. But it was diverted because the city that has its politics, they were looked after, but the tribal community is completely discounted. So there's no place for this in both stories, actually. And this is your point. They're invisible. Yes, that is important. And so this is the dominant, these are the dominant narratives right now. They erase. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Which is in contrast to the slide before. Yes, exactly. Is there any other response before we, is it interesting to look at technique? Because some of you are interested, practitioners are very interested in technique. So let's do that then. So normally when I teach a workshop, I get 2 days. And what I get is I give an overview of some of the theoretical ideas. We talk about some of the practices. And then, of course, the key thing is to try them out, which we're not going to be able to do because we don't have the time for that. But this is an introduction to some of the practices. But even then, I would hope that some of these ideas you can incorporate, those of you who are practitioners. So we'll look at each one in turn. So the first one is separate meetings with parties who are in conflict. Always meet with parties separately, and we map out what is your hopes and what is your goal. What do you want to achieve? And we spend a lot of time starting there. We don't go to the problem-saturated story first. Tell us what you want to achieve. After we have gone through this process together, what would you be feeling pleased with? What would success look like? Once we are done with the process, what has happened in the process? What have you done differently? What are you thinking about that's necessary that would fulfill your hopes and ideas? And then we really start teasing out what is the values that underpin the hopes. So it's kind of like interest-based mediation in the sense of, well, what are your interests going forward? But we want to know value and ethic that underpins the hopes. So what we would, let's go back to family. We have a father say, I want to have more time with my child. That's what I want. The child is with the mother. I'm not getting my time. I need more time. So we deconstruct that. Tell us about the importance of you being involved with your son and daughter. Tell us the significance. What is the meanings behind you wanting this kind of connection? And what is it that you care about in relation to having this time with your child? What is the significance of that to you? So we could make guesses and assume, right? Well, it's your son. Of course, why wouldn't you want to be with your son? But we want to get people being explicit about value and ethic and motive and exposing them. We want to be able to keep track. So when you say you're wanting to have good relations with your ex-partner, and now they are in a fight in the mediation room, they are attacking one another, say pause, just please pause. I'm thinking about what you were asking for in coming today. What you spoke about having good relations. You spoke about your hopes of getting to a better place. Right now, this doesn't look like what you came for. Are you willing to stop engaging this way and to come back to what it was you are wanting me to help you do? So we use the hopes and the goals as a way of staying on track when the mediation is going to spiral off into this way and that way. And so the narrative mediator is tracking very closely, are we in alignment with the goals that we have all sat down to create? And so narrative mediation is quite structured in that regard. Some mediation practices, you bring the people together and you let them go. And they will be mad, they'll be angry, there'll be some fighting, but the mediator helps let it all out. In narrative work, the mediator is very prominent in managing and directing and also using their expertise to help facilitate the use of the story in the mediation itself. So back to hopes and goals, we're looking at people's motivations, their purposes, and we're looking for any ways we can bring in cooperation as part of the goal and the hope. Are you wanting to have a better relationship with the ex-partner? Yes, I do want to have a better relationship. Tell me about that. Tell me about your desire of wanting a better relationship. So we're using curiosity to kind of come to understand. We also want to take full advantage of the beginning of the mediation where people are showing up wanting to demonstrate their reasonableness and their best selves. So they're wanting to show you, you should come on my side because, of course, I'm the most reasonable person in the room. So we want to harness the cultural capital of the beginning process, the beginning rituals, and really hold on and savor that time, because we're going to need to come back to it when the going might get a little bit rougher. So now we come to this idea of externalizing, separating out the problem from the person. The problem is the problem. The person is not the problem. So in the individual meetings, we might be asking questions like, what might you call this thing, the problem? What might you call this? Is it a conflict? How would you name it? And they might say, the name of the problem is my ex-partner, Daniel. He's the problem. And so as a narrative mediator, we are expecting that, because that's what people do. They characterize the problem as the other party. So then we're going to say, well, tell me more. And we find out that Daniel represents disrespect, mistrust, harm, humiliation. And so we are then starting to replace Daniel as the problem with, we're now focusing on the theme of the story, which is the problem is disrespect or mistrust or whatever it might be. And we asked, and so we create some names for it, for the problem. We might just call it, or the conflict, or the mistrust, or whatever it is. Sometimes people don't know what to call it, because they're so focused on the character. So what I might do is say to them, tell me from these choices, is it more about misunderstanding? Is it more towards fear of what might happen next? Is it more about this, that? And I'll give out a series of maybe 5 different possibilities about what resonates, if people are struggling to name. And then they'll say, well, it's definitely not that, it's not that, it's maybe more like this. And then we negotiate back and forth and come up with some descriptions that capture the essence of the problem story. So how long has this problem been around? So this is the entry into the problem-saturated story. What does the problem tell you about yourself and the other person? And this is part of a technique where we say, does the problem follow you into your work life? Is it affecting your work, this problem? How is it affecting your home life? How is it affecting your friendships? How is it affecting your self-esteem? How is it affecting your financial situation? So in the individual separate meetings, not the joint meeting, in the separate meeting, we will externalize and map the effects of the problem in all of their lives. And oftentimes people have not thought about this because they're so focused on the other, so focused on the hurt in the other. They're not thinking, what is the hurt doing to me? Now, can you think about how that technique might link with some of the theory that I spoke of earlier? Can you think of a link between the mapping and Gregory Bateson's work, for example? Can anyone help me out here and make a link between a concept that I spoke of earlier and how then it links now to this practice? Great.
Here we go. Is this related to the frogs and creating difference?
Yes.
Yeah.
So tell us a little more about your thoughts on this.
Well, because the frog in the pot of cold water that is being heated progressively lacks awareness of his own situation and environment. So you're calling all these questions externalizing, and it sounds to me like you want to separate the focus on the other as the problem, and to kind of externalize that in two directions. On the one hand, as you said earlier, you want to separate the other and the problem. So that's one part of the externalization. And the other part is more reflective. It's taking the party to the conflict out of the conflict so that he or she can become the observer of the conflict. So awareness of the other as distinct from the problem, or awareness of the problem as distinct from the other, and aware of myself as party to the conflict and what the hell's going on, as opposed to the constant adjustment to the increasing discomfort to the point where you crack or die.
And or die, or commit suicide, or something similar. Yes, thank you so much. I would say, wanting to turn the heat on the element up rapidly. So I want the party who is, like you just said, is slowly responding to more suffering and more suffering and more suffering and more suffering, and it's turned very quickly up. A full-blown experience of the conflict story on me and my family or my community. And what my hope there is, as we turn up the heat so fast on it, the blast coming, that I want people to say something like this: when I came to you, I thought we had a big problem, but now I realize it is way worse than I even thought. I want them to be motivated to do something different. Oh my God, it is causing me this suffering. It's affecting my sleep. It's affecting my relationships at home with my friends. They're sick of hearing me talk about my story of my bad ex-husband. I can't concentrate at work. It's affecting, oh my gosh, yes, it's doing all of these things to me. And then the technique, I don't think I got this technique up there, but the technique is, would you like the situation to continue like this? Or would you like something to change? And I say, yeah, I'd like him to stop doing what he's doing. Okay. Has he stopped doing what he's doing? No. Has anyone got any power and magic over him to stop him saying and doing those things? Do you have that power? Do you think I could show up and stop him from, I have that so much influence? And then to turn the heat up even more, I'm going to say, let's imagine that you're going to carry on experiencing what you're experiencing, and they're continuing to do what they're doing, and things. What's it going to be like in 6 months' time? Is it the same? No, it's not the same. Is it worse? Yes, it's worse. Even worse than it is right now. So it's a technique called collapsing time. So then I say, well, today is May 19th, 2018. We're now a year later, and here we are sitting together. What is happening to you now? Oh, it's even worse than before. Now, I'm not even sure that I can function at all. So in my mind, I have these two frogs. And I don't want the first frog to just keep adjusting, 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 adjusting. I'm wanting to disrupt as much as I can while supporting them. And so when I ask, do you want things to carry on or do you want things to be different? It's very likely they're going to tell me that they want something different to happen, that they have some influence over, because we've already talked about that. It's clear that if you'd had influence, you wouldn't be coming to see me in the first place, right? So then, this is the important piece, we then find out, tell me about you wanting something different. I want to spend time understanding your preference for something different. We don't gloss over that. And they're going to say, well, I can't stand this anymore. I can't live this way. We can't live this way. So tell me more about your ideas, about something else. Now we're on a new trajectory. We've had the goals of what we want to accomplish. Now we've had a big problem-saturated story. We've heard that. But the hearing of the story, we are externalizing. And we're mapping the effects of the story as it goes. So it's a different telling. It's not the same telling as the neighbor across the street or telling the hairdresser, oh, I can't tell you what he did today or what they said today. So it's a different telling of the story. And we are disrupting it. And then we are moving towards preferences, some new possibility. How much power does the story have over you? Does it interfere with your best intentions? And does it affect your preferences for how things could be different? So this is a path towards the alternative story. So here's an example, and I apologize that when we're in English, the subtlety of the changes. But if you imagined in your own language, in Portuguese, in Spanish and French, that you could do this in your own language, but the subtlety is important. So in English, a lot of people say, how do you feel? How does that make you feel? It's very common in English. When you hear a reporter and they say some terrible thing has happened, they say, how does that make you feel? And in externalizing, we flip it over. So we say, what did what happened get you to feel? So the first one is, how do you feel? It internalizes. We want to externalize and look at what the events that happened, what did the events do to you in your feelings? So it flips it over. What is your issue with what she does? Which is focusing on what she does. This is what she does, focusing on her. To when she does that, what does it get you to do? So it flips it back, not focusing on the problem person, but focusing on the impact of the behavior on the person. So we externalize it. What are you angry about becomes, under what circumstances does anger show up? So rather than an angry person, we're looking at anger as an entity, as an externalized force, and what the anger is doing. And so narrative mediation is when you say, tell me an example of a practice, externalizing is a very significant element to this process. It sounds like you feel really strongly about that. Is that right? And then flipping it, these events have got you to feel really strongly. So we juxtapose again the outside. Mapping the effects, I've been talking about that. We ask about the effects of the conflict, ask about causes that make the conflict seem inevitable, and it's more productive of change to ask about effects. And here's some example. What damage has it done? What effect is it having right now? And if it were to keep on happening, where might things end up? So it's an illustration of the points I was making before. Talked about this. What are the effects of the problem on these areas of one's life? Feelings, communication, physical well-being, economic circumstances. How is it affecting how you see yourself in the world? What's that doing to you, that problem? How is it affecting how you see yourself? How is it affecting your relationships with others? Some other examples. Does anyone use scaling questions? Yes. Scaling questions are wonderful to concretize the issues. On a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is no concerns and 10 is overwhelming concerns, how could you rate this present situation? We'll often do that. And you will often experience, if you ask that question and someone is pretty upset, what do you imagine the number is that they're going to say? They're going to say 10. They're going to say, oh, I'm completely overwhelmed. And then, but you don't want them to say that in a narrative perspective, because you want to look for the blue objects, the things that are not part of the conflict story. And so when people might ask the scale 1 to 10 and they say 10, you go, what can I do with that? Because there's nowhere to go. So I'm going to challenge that answer. And I challenge it this way. If it was 10, it would have completely dominated your life. You wouldn't be sitting here talking to me. You wouldn't have come to a mediation. Because the 10 represents overwhelming hopelessness. You would not be here trying to figure out some other alternative. Right? Yeah. So then they're going to say, okay, 9. 9 out of 10. Because they want to tell you how terrible it is. And so you say, well, that is a lot. 9 out of 10. That's nearly using up so much of your life. It's affecting all these areas that we've spoken about. Tell me, you know where I'm going to go with this, right? What am I going to ask? Tell me about the one. Tell me about that. How have you been able to hold some hope, some possibility that things could be otherwise? How have you been able to come here and come with some hope that something might be other than what it is that you're having to live with? And I know it's big. We've talked about that. What starts to happen is that as we focus on the one, and we've already heard the 9, listen to that, listen to that, listen to that. We now start to talk about their hope about possibility and be very curious. So I think of myself as holding a giant magnifying glass. You know, the glass that you hold up to the paper and you get the sun shining through the magnifying glass and you light it up on the paper and the sunlight is channeled through the magnifying glass and you start to burn a hole in the paper. I think about that metaphor as I'm grabbing the energies about hopefulness and possibility and lining them up and directing them into a particular area of inquiry to open up possibility of things that could be otherwise. So, for example, the mother says, separated couple, divorcing couple. And I ask, has there been anything that's happened recently that has had any part of respect or working together or even short, small moments of getting along? And they go, I can't think of anything. Can you tell me, is there any time where you even cooperated, even just for a short period, where you're not shouting at one another or arguing or any time? And, you know, someone may say, well, Mary was in the hospital last week. She had a chest infection. We took her to the doctor, and we weren't fighting in the hospital room, right? We weren't fighting in the hospital room. Or when Mark came to pick up Donald, we didn't fight at the doorway on Thursday. Really? You didn't have a fight on Thursday. What possibly could have been going on that stopped you having an argument or a fight on Thursday? Well, I don't know. You just came in, picked up Donald, and went. Isn't that how it normally should be? No, not really. You could easily have had a big fight, and people fight all day long. How come you didn't? So I'm very curious, using the magnifying glass to zero in on any actions and practices and behaviors that we can start a storying process of the alternative narrative. So, but one lived event is not enough to build an alternative story. We need a series of lived experiences to start connecting them together, because we always need a series of events to link to create a story. So we're looking at building. So every session, after we've heard the problem-saturated story, we're looking at building an alternative. I did have that up there, evaluating preferences, asking people to take a stand against the problem, invite them to explain why they want to take a stand against the problem and do something different, ask them about how they're evaluating their choices, and ask them about what these expressions would lead to. So given that you're making some new choices about which direction you want to head, where might that take you? So we want to explore that. So I have another clip. Let me just check first to see if it's the one that I think it is, because it's a black screen right now. Yeah. So this clip is another advertisement. It's a FedEx advertisement. Some of you are familiar with the FedEx company, big company that moves goods around the world, FedEx. And there was a movie, Hollywood movie, made around a FedEx story. Does anyone know the name of that movie? That's right. It's a movie called Castaways. And the character in the movie, Tom Hanks, was on this plane. The plane crashed into the ocean, and all the FedEx packages were floating in the water and all around. And he was trapped on this island for years, trying to hold on to sanity. So this advertisement plays off of that movie of someone trapped on an island, completely cut off, trying to stay sane and trying to find a way of escape. But remember the story that the FedEx plane had all the packages floating in the water. So that's the key thing to think about to make meaning of the story. And the guy in the advertisement, this is a critical piece to say to this part. He's now been found, and he's still got a FedEx package that went down on the plane, and he's going to return the FedEx package to the person it was to be sent to. Okay, that's the other important piece. Okay, so he's going to the door to return the package after being trapped on that island.
Hi.
Hi.
I was marooned on an island for 5 years with this package, and I swore that I would deliver it to you because I work for FedEx.
That's very admirable. Thank you.
Hey, but by the way, what's in the package?
Nothing really. Just a satellite phone, GPS locator, fishing rod, water purifier, and some seeds. Just silly stuff. Thank you again. You keep up the good work.
So just to restate, in the package, satellite communication, GPS locator, and some seeds. Just silly stuff. And I think of that in this work, that we are all the time in our conflict work, in our mediation work, we are always presented with resources that are there. It's not obvious. If it was obvious, we wouldn't be having the conflict. We could figure things out really easily. But if you have the mindset that there's always resources, materials, knowledge, artifact, that if our eyes are open, we are listening for opportunity, hidden in the conflict story. There are resources there. If we look for it, if we think back to the basketball, if we're only looking at the basketball passing, it's the only thing we're looking at, we're not seeing right in front of us the gorilla standing there looking at us. And so the narrative work is very much of that vein. Pay attention to what is constantly emerging. Just put so much weight on the fact that you are sitting with these people in the first place, because that could easily not happen. You know, people say, oh, mandatory mediation, I had to come. No, you didn't. You didn't have to come. You could easily not be here, easily not having a conversation with me. You could be fighting and carrying on. It's so easy. But you came. Let's figure out how come you came. What is it about you coming? I train therapists with this, not in mediation, but in therapy. And they say, I love this idea. They think, oh, this is cool. I want to do this. So they sit down and they're working with someone and they're wanting to find out about the lived experience that's not part of the problem. And they say, I couldn't find anything. There isn't anything that's going good. There's nothing that's we can choose to draw on to build. So that doesn't work. I like the idea, but it doesn't work in practice. But they're not thinking about the other. So I used to work with people who are very, very depressed. Very big depressions. The people are coming to my office. They are all dressed. They came on time. They are driving themselves to my office and going home. And I say, tell me, what's your problem? Oh, I am so depressed. My life is so heavy, and I am so despairing. And they just tell me this very, very sad story. But in my mind, I'm thinking, wait a second. I remember my sister, personal story, my sister having a major depressive episode. She was in a fetal position in the bed for 10 days, not getting up, washing, trying to eat. So the depression can overwhelm you and make you not even be able to stand up. But you have come to me, my office, you're dressed. What are you doing? How are you getting here? How are you mobilizing yourself? How did you get out of bed? How did you get dressed and wash? It's amazing. So we can just miss all of the signals. So the training for this work is training for looking with curiosity and persistence to find this. So, and we're nearly there. So some questions. Can you tell me any times you experience, even for a brief period, some relief from the problem? Some relief. Just for a brief time. What did you do? How did you do that? What difference did it make that you did that? What does it say about you that you did that? So the practice has a series of particular questions that often you don't normally think to ask. There are a series of questions that come from another perspective. And it takes, if you like these ideas, it takes a while to practice a question that you could get entry into the alternative story. I call these smalling questions. How have you kept things from getting worse? How come it is not a 10 and leaving you completely overwhelmed? How come it's not that? Can you tell me a time when the problem was slightly less severe? Slightly less severe. Because if you can say, can you tell me a time where the problem was not there? I don't think so. I can't think of the time when the problem wasn't there. It's always there. But when it was less severe, a little bit. Some examples. Have there been times that you have been able to cooperate a little more, even for brief periods of time, and so on? You get the idea. So that's part of the practice. And then there's more questions. What skills or abilities did you use to prevent this issue from being dragged into the conflict? Or now we come back to value here. Are there some principles that might be drawn from this experience that can be used to address these other problems? And as we move towards their closure, I'm wanting to show you how important the individual meetings are to do all of this work first, before we bring the parties together. So I'm building this relationship, getting a strong, trusting relationship with the parties, having them talk about their hopes, understanding the problem story, and finding new possibilities for when we come together as a joint session. Then there's a joint session. What are we striving to do in the joint session? We want to look for mutual hopes and preferences. We have externalized the conflict together. We've identified the costs of conflict on the parties. We're bringing forward areas of new cooperation. And then lastly, developing a plan about what to do with these issues. So that's a little bit of overview, and I'll tell you a story that illustrates some of this. I'm working with two scientists. They have just won a multi-million-dollar grant. millions of dollars these two scientists have been awarded for their research. And because I come from New Zealand, and because I am around a lot of sheep, these researchers are working on cloning a sheep. The genetic components of two sheep being cloned to create this cloned sheep, this hybrid sheep. These two scientists have been working together for 10 years, but their relationship has broken down. So they're so smart. They have so much money to do the research, but they can't communicate or talk together. And so I meet with one and say, well, we used to have a friendship. We used to have dinner together with our family. But now we don't meet at all to talk. They're in this lab together. But they try and talk, and it's stressful, and they're not getting anything meaningfully done. So I'm meeting with them individually, and they're telling me that they had some good times before, but now it's just misery, misery, misery. And if they can't work together, what happens? The grant is lost, taken away. There's a lot at stake. So I have 2 individual meetings with each of the parties. One of the parties tells me, you know, now I'm mapping the effects. How has this problem affected you? He said, I've never told anyone this, but I want to tell you this. I have not had sex with my wife for 18 months. The stress is so big. It's gone on, and my relationship at home is badly damaged. This is how terrible it's going. So I say at the end of the individual session, are there any things you've shared with me in our individual session that we cannot talk about in the joint session? This is very critical. What can we talk about? What can't we talk about? Most people, when you've done this work, they go, oh, I want them to know about how the story is affecting me. That's all right. Okay, so now joint session. And I say to this gentleman, would it be okay if I asked you to tell me the story you told me about what effects this problem has had on your relationship? Because they don't talk anymore. They used to, couples, meet for dinner, now not. Yeah, I'm okay with that. Yes, I have not had sex with my wife for 18 months because of this crazy stuff that's going on in our lives. The other scientist looks at the guy and says, I didn't think you cared at all that we were not getting along. You come across as though this is not even touching you, that you're not even worried about this. This is shocking for you to tell me that this is really affecting you like that at home. That got his attention and said, it's happening. I have the same troubles. This is spilling over to my whole life too. Now they're starting to share about their own misery and joining around the misery of the effects of the conflict. But it was that one event of the developing some empathy of some effect of the problem-saturated story that proved to be an opening. That was the opening to be able to then start to track. And then I could say, can you tell me the last time that you were able, even for a few minutes, to listen to the other? And I said, oh yeah, on Monday we had a conversation about how we were going to do the budget for the grant. Wait a second, you said on Monday you had talked about the budget? Yeah. Tell me about the conversation on Monday where you were talking about the budget. And now we're off. And then it was the budget, and then yes, it's over here, and then we did this over there. And now we're linking the events together. And then we come to the moment where we say, do you want the problem-saturated story to carry on? Do you want to go back to your respective parts in the lab? Or is the conversation you're having now, do you want more of that? What do you want? This way or that way? Fork in the road. More drama and suffering, or more opening to this? Oh no, we want to figure this out. And now we're moving. Now we're moving the restraints, like back to the curling, where we're sweeping the ice in particular ways to let the stone move down the path, sweeping and working together as a team to move the stone to the place of cooperation. So now we can work together about the grant, the multi-million-dollar grant. We can start doing our research together, and we're freeing ourselves and moving. So it's an example of narrative mediation, even in an organization with science, hard science, that the sex life of a scientist becomes important in breaking through to negotiation. And that's not a particularly conventional approach to mediation, but it does illustrate the work. So the individual sessions are critical, and then we can draw into the joint session things that are helpful. And I wasn't going to, the last bits, but Sarah Cobb's work, if you're interested in looking, those of you that work in organizations, working in large contexts, Sarah's book, A Narrative Perspective on Mediation Towards the Materialization of the Storytelling Metaphor, and her work, her book, great book, Speaking of Violence, The Politics and Poetics of Narrative in Conflict Resolution, is a great resource for those of you doing large-scale, macro-level work on the narrative metaphor. And then there are our books with my friend and colleague John Winslade that lay out much more of the theoretical framework and lots of illustrations and stories and examples of the practice. So that's what I want to share with you today, just with a couple of minutes to spare. And I don't think Pascal is here, is she? Pascal? Or Méline? But I just wanted to publicly acknowledge the two for putting this event on and bringing us together. They have just been both so wonderful. So I just wanted to make sure I did that publicly. Anyone wanted to make any final comments before we wrap up? Well, there's Pascal. I was just acknowledging you and all of your assistants for making all of this happen. Thank you so much. I'm not surprised you're not in the room because you're doing all of the things out there that you have been constantly doing. And this has been more than a year in the making to put all of this together. So, Minera, so yes, please, go ahead. Have we got a microphone? Yeah. For the number of sessions? Yeah. Yes, I'll repeat the question.
Okay.
How much time does this practice take? It seems like it could take a long time. A lot of the work we're doing are in contexts that involve relationships. Tenant, landlord, family, business, tribal communities trying to figure out how to work together. Making a parenting plan. I was just with a group of family mediators teaching this work, and they asked the same question. And I said, well, how many sessions can you have? They said, we can have 2 individual sessions, maybe have an extra one of individual, and then we can have 3 sessions, joint sessions, up to 3. I said, you can do a lot of work, a lot of good work in that. If you've got a one-off session, one joint session, it would be very difficult to create the context, create that kind of context. So a morning mediation, afternoon mediation, you can use some of the techniques in terms of externalizing, but in terms of using the full body of work, it does take more time than that. But thanks for that. That's a really relevant question. Yeah. Here's one over here.
Gracias. Le pregunto si esta mediación narrativa es posible en conflictos de violencia política. Por ejemplo, caso Siria, caso Venezuela, donde hay muchos grupos con distintas ideologías y donde lo que uno aprecia es que uno quiere sacar a uno para ponerse el otro. En esos casos, ¿es posible la aplicación de esta metodología? ¿Ha tenido usted experiencia en casos de violencia política aplicando mediación narrativa?
Yes, well, the work in Myanmar, in 2010, we brought, there were 5 different tribal groups, heads of the tribal groups that were fighting one another. We took them out of Myanmar. It was too dangerous to meet in Myanmar in 2010. And we were across the border in Thailand. And we had a week together of working together and using the narrative practices and working out what those leaders were going to do in returning to their communities and bringing the elements of the mediation process. And I wasn't doing that work, but Jane Doherty from Eastern Mennonite University, she was living in Myanmar and then working with those leaders for weeks and months, building relationship, and then starting to bring the senior leadership together to talk about their peacemaking plans. And to get to where a lot of the ethnic different groups came together in the last couple of years, there was a really tiny part that we played and that people like Jane Doherty put into building enough trust, because it's all about the trust, isn't it? So much about trust. Building enough trust to come to the table and to be able to coordinate and plan together. We also worked in the Green Zone in Nicosia with the Turkish Cypriot civil society leaders and Greek Cypriot civil society leaders. We had a series of meetings with them. We brought those leaders to San Diego for a week. And this, again, is a few years ago. And you look at what's been going on in Cyprus for decades and decades. They still have the line arbitrarily drawn across Cyprus. But today, there's probably more hope than there's been in a long while of looking at the Turkish and Greek Cypriots being able to come together. And this work takes so long. The grievances are so great. So it's a long, long-term process of scaffolding and all of the hundreds and hundreds of efforts that multiple people all over the world and multiple efforts of the people in the country to make these small steps. And I'm not claiming in any way that that was anything of magnitude that we were doing, but again, it was a small effort moving the curling stone down the path. And so any efforts along the way. So it's hard to evaluate value, but anything that is moving towards building trust and trying to separate, externalize the problem and how it's affecting all of us, we come together, joining together about the suffering. And so that's best I can do. But I think just really humble effort. You have something you would like to say? Yes, sir. Just at the back.
Oui. Est-ce que, à votre connaissance, il n'existe pas un lien entre votre technique que vous utilisez? Okay. Y a-t-il un lien entre la technique que vous utilisez et la technique de la négociation raisonnée? Parce que dans la technique de négociation raisonnée, on fait la séparation entre le différent et les personnes. Donc, en quelque sorte, est-ce que ce n'est pas votre technique de négociation narrative n'est pas une négociation raisonnée en quelque sorte?
Yes, that's great to hear. And even in the interest-based work, they also talk about externalizing. Reason, it's the same thing. Oh, it's the same approach. Yes, yes. But I think the difference is we are, the externalizing practices are so much at the heart of the whole process and constantly looking at the relationship between problem and person. And so while the interests focus on interest and not the problem, in that sense, we're looking like kind of the way I started the session of talking about the macro level forces that are at play. We're looking at the macro level cultural forces that are impacting and shaping rather than contrasting an interest with a problem. So from my bias, I would say we grab that concept and work with it in a much more focused way in terms of the narrative work. But it certainly does connect with that practice. So you get the last word, apart from me saying let's wrap up.
Dans votre approche, est-ce que c'est nécessaire d'avoir plusieurs rencontres avec un temps de réflexion entre les rencontres, avec un temps où les personnes peuvent mijoter dans leur jus comme la grenouille dans l'histoire?
That's very helpful. Very helpful when you can do that. But things are fast moving. So a lot happens in one session. So you have to grab it when it goes past. Because if you say your homework exercise between the next time we meet is to think about some things that might be helpful, the moments tend to have been lost, and in the spaces they revert to the reenactment of the problem-saturated story. So the spaces in between, if you're not grabbing the work in the session itself, can be lost. So it's grabbing the moments, doing the storying, and once that is done, that can be a reference point in the gaps for looking for more evidence of the emerging new things. But the sessions themselves, that work has to be done. And yes, when it's done well, then the reflection in between can be very helpful. But giving people some homework to think about an idea, often I've never felt that has worked very well. It's lunchtime, so thank you so much, everybody. Have a nice lunch, and appreciate it. Yeah.